The room is quiet now, and in that quiet, a question drifts softly through the dark. Why do certain thoughts follow us through centuries like shadows that never quite fade? Why do some ideas rest gently in our dreams, yet stir unease in our waking hours? Tonight, we step into the slow, candlelit world of Carl Jung, a man who listened not only to people, but to their dreams, their fears, and the hidden symbols whispering beneath their words. His ideas still breathe through our films, our stories, our fears, and even the parts of ourselves we rarely speak aloud. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and let this story carry you gently into the deeper layers of the mind. If these words guide you a little closer to rest, if this story feels like quiet company in the dark, you are warmly invited to stay with this channel, night after night, as we wander through history together, slowly and softly. The child was small against the wide sky of the Swiss countryside, a quiet figure moving along narrow paths where grass bent under morning dew and distant bells breathed time into the air. Carl Jung did not yet have a name for the strange heaviness and wonder that lived inside his chest. But even then, he felt it, like a secret tide pulling at him from somewhere deep and unseen. While other children laughed easily and ran toward the noise of the world, he often drifted toward silence, toward shadows that felt less empty than they seemed. At night, the world did not go to sleep for him. It opened. Dreams came thick and vivid, filled with images that lingered long after morning arrived. He would wake with his heart quietly racing, unsure whether what he had seen belonged to him or to something older, something shared. There were moments when he felt watched by unseen eyes, not with fear exactly, but with presence, as if the dark itself had a kind of awareness. He did not speak of these things. Words felt too small to hold them. His father was a pastor, a man of God and Scripture, standing at the pulpit each Sunday with calm authority. Yet in the walls of their home, Jung sensed a quiet tension, a fragile space between faith spoken aloud and faith silently questioned. He watched his father struggle with doubt, though it was never named, and in that silent struggle, Jung learned that belief itself could carry shadows. From his mother, he sensed another mystery, a shifting presence that felt warm one moment and distant the next, as if she moved between two worlds he could not yet see. Often, young Carl wandered alone. The forests became his sanctuary, the lake his mirror. Trees did not judge his quiet. Water did not ask him to explain his thoughts. In these spaces, he felt both small and vast at once, like a single note inside an endless song. Sometimes he built tiny stone towers in secret places, stacking rock upon rock with careful hands. He never told anyone about them. They were not toys. They were offerings to something he could feel but not name. At school, he learned his lessons well, yet a quiet distance always lingered around him. He could be friendly, even kind, but there was an inner room he never invited anyone into. Other children sensed this and kept a respectful distance, as if he carried an invisible boundary. In the soft cruelty of youth, he learned early what it meant to feel separate. And in that separation, his inner world only deepened. There were moments when he felt split in two. One part of him moved through the ordinary world, answering questions, following rules, smiling when expected. The other watched from a distance, older somehow, more patient, more curious about eternity than about games. He once described this second presence as someone ancient living quietly inside him, observing his life as if it were a story. This feeling did not frighten him, fascinated him. As he grew older, books became companions that never demanded too much. He read of science and philosophy, of gods and myths, of alchemy and medicine. Each subject felt like a different doorway into the same vast room. Yet the more he learned, the more questions multiplied. Science spoke in numbers and proof. Spirituality spoke in symbols and faith. And Jung felt himself stretched gently, painfully, between both. There were nights when fear came quietly, not with screams but with a tightness in the chest, a sense that the world was far stranger than anyone admitted. During one powerful dream, he imagined the earth opening beneath a cathedral, descending into deeper and darker layers until he reached a glowing chamber filled with ancient mystery. He woke unsettled, yet strangely comforted, as if he had touched something sacred and terrifying at once. Long afterward, the image lingered like a faint echo beneath every waking thought. His decision to study medicine was, on the surface, practical. A solid path, a respectable future. Yet beneath that choice flowed a deeper hunger. He wanted to understand suffering, not only in the body but in the soul. He wanted to understand why people hurt in ways that left no visible wound. He wanted to understand his own divided feeling, the 1 foot in light, 1 foot in shadow existence that had followed him since childhood. As he stepped into adulthood, the quiet boy did not vanish. He simply learned to carry his silence more skillfully. University halls replaced forest paths. Lecture notes replaced wandering thoughts. Yet even there, surrounded by stone buildings and sharp minds, he felt the same strange pull inward. While others chased recognition and certainty, Jung listened for meaning in places that could not be measured. There were moments of doubt, heavy and slow. What if these inner images meant nothing? What if the depth he sensed was only imagination? What if the world truly was only what could be weighed and counted? These questions circled him like distant thunder, never quite breaking, never fully leaving him alone. And yet, each time he tried to turn away from the invisible, something softly called him back. His path began to narrow toward the human mind. Psychiatry drew him not with promises of answers, but with the quiet permission to ask dangerous questions. Here, finally, was a field that stood at the edge between flesh and thought, between visible illness and invisible pain. As he took his first steps into this world, he did not yet know that his own childhood shadows had been preparing him all along. And so, as the nights continued to whisper through his dreams and the days guided his outward steps, Carl Jung stood at the threshold of a life that would lead him straight into the depths he had sensed since he was a child. He did not know what waited there. He only knew that the door was opening, and in the stillness before that doorway, his journey quietly began. The hospital corridors were cool and pale, echoing with soft footsteps and the distant rhythm of pulse and breath. Jung moved through them with quiet attention, still carrying the forests and dreams of his childhood inside his chest. Here, suffering wore faces and names. Here, pain spoke in trembling voices and restless eyes. For the first time, the mysteries he had long felt in silence now stood before him in human form. At the Bergalsley Psychiatric Hospital, the air felt heavy with unspoken stories. Patients drifted through their days like travelers between worlds, some locked inside terrors only they could see, others trapped in sorrow that clung like fog. Many were dismissed as broken, their words ignored, their inner lives treated as noise. But Jung listened. He did not listen only for symptoms. He listened for meaning. In the way a woman repeated the same phrase again and again, he sensed not madness, but a message buried beneath fear. In the way a man stared at unseen presences, he felt not emptiness, but a world too full. Jung began to feel what he had always suspected. The mind was not a machine that simply malfunctioned. It was a landscape, and some people were lost within it. Late at night, when the hospital quieted and lamps dimmed, he returned to his own small room and wrote. He wrote not only notes and observations, but questions. Why did the same images appear in different patients who had never met? Why did certain dreams echo ancient myths he had read as a boy? Why did suffering often wear the same symbolic masks across different lives? These thoughts did not shout. They whispered, and he leaned closer. During these early years, loneliness followed him like a familiar shadow. Surrounded by people, yet inwardly alone, he still felt that quiet distance he had known as a child. His work set him apart. His curiosity unsettled some of his colleagues. While many sought quick classifications and folders for human pain, Jung lingered in the spaces between labels. He was less interested in naming the storm than in understanding the sky that birthed it. There were nights when exhaustion pressed down on him, heavy as the dark itself. The faces of patients followed him into sleep, their voices braided into his dreams. Sometimes he feared that by listening too deeply, he might lose his way back. At other times, he felt that this closeness to suffering was not a danger, but a calling. as if every life he encountered was part of a vast, unfinished story he had been invited to read. In those years, he began refining the art of word association, a method where patients spoke the first word that came to mind in response to his quiet prompts. It seemed simple, yet beneath the surface, hidden tremors revealed themselves. Hesitations, slips of the tongue, sudden changes in breath. Each tiny pause carried weight. Jung realized that even in our most casual words, something deeper is always speaking. With each discovery, a quiet excitement stirred in him. He was not chasing recognition. He was chasing understanding. And in that pursuit, another presence began to take shape in his life. A name spoken with both admiration and caution in the halls of medicine. Sigmund Freud. Before they met, Jung read Freud's work with a mixture of awe and unease. Here was a man who dared to speak of the hidden forces beneath polite society, who traced desire and fear through the private corridors of the human psyche. Jung felt a strange recognition as he turned the pages. This was someone else listening to the same underground river. Yet where Jung felt the pull of myth and symbol, Freud stood firmly in the language of instinct and structure. Their first meeting would come later, but even before it happened, Jung felt the current of that future encounter drawing near, like distant thunder beyond the hills. For now, he continued to walk between worlds, between the measured precision of medicine and the shimmering uncertainty of dreams, between the outer discipline of his profession and the inner wildness of his thoughts. There were evenings when he doubted everything, his path, his instincts, the invisible thread he felt guiding him. In candlelight, with books spread around him like quiet witnesses, he wondered whether his hunger for meaning was foolish, whether he was reaching for shadows once again. Yet each doubt was followed by a small miracle, a patient who found relief after being truly heard, a dream that unlocked buried sorrow, a moment of sudden clarity when scattered thoughts aligned like stars. These moments did not roar, they glowed, soft, steady, undeniable. And slowly, without grand declarations, Jung began to trust the quiet voice that had followed him since childhood. The voice that whispered that the unseen mattered just as much as the seen, that symbols were not childish fantasies, but living bridges between worlds, that within every human being slept an entire universe of memory, fear, longing, and light. The boy who once built secret stone towers was still there, stacking meaning in silence. Only now, the stones were words, dreams, and fragile human lives, each placed carefully, each held with reverence. As the years pressed forward and his reputation began its first slow rise, Jung stood on the edge of a meeting that would change everything, a friendship that would shape his destiny, a clash of minds that would open doors neither man could yet imagine. And somewhere deep within him, the child who listened to shadows felt the air shift, as if the story of his life were about to turn a page. And so, as the night of his early journey folded gently into the dawn of something greater, his path curved quietly toward another soul who listened to the dark. The first letter arrived like a soft knock in the quiet of Jung's inner world. It carried the weight of recognition, the careful tone of a man who had seen another mind moving along a similar edge. When Jung unfolded the pages and read Freud's words, he felt a subtle shift inside his chest, the kind that comes when something long unnamed suddenly finds a voice. Their ideas touched first like distant stars, not yet colliding, only circling in thoughtful light. What followed was a slow exchange of thoughts, careful at first, then warmer with each passing letter. Dreams, symbols, fears, hidden desires, the strange rules that governed inner life. They wrote not as rivals, but as explorers who had finally discovered another lantern glowing in the dark. For Jung, these words were not merely intellectual nourishment. They were companionship. He had spent so much of his life walking alone with questions. Now someone else was walking beside him. When they finally met in person, time itself seemed to loosen its grip. Their conversation stretched on for hours, then days, as if neither could bear to be the first to fall silent. Two men stood face to face, different in temperament yet bound by the same restless hunger to understand the human soul. Freud, older, confident, anchored in theory and structure. Jung, younger, searching, his eyes still carrying the lakes and forests of his childhood. To the outside world, this meeting was the beginning of an intellectual partnership. To Jung, it felt like standing in the eye of a gathering storm, filled with both promise and danger. He admired Freud deeply, not as an idol, but as a fellow traveler who had mapped territory few dared to enter. And for a time, Freud seemed to see in Jung something of his own unfinished reflection. Yet even in those early days of warmth and admiration, faint ripples of difference moved beneath the surface. Freud spoke of the mind in clear lines, tracing most shadows back to desire and repression. Jung listened carefully, nodded, respected the structure. But in his own heart, he felt the pull of something wider, something older than desire alone. Myths, gods, ancient images that appeared unbidden in the dreams of ordinary people. He did not yet argue. He waited. Jung had always been a listener before he became a speaker. Between hospital duties and long evenings of study, Jung felt stretched between two worlds more vividly than ever before. The scientific world demanded proof, clarity, solid ground. His inner world offered symbols, paradox, questions that blossomed instead of closing. At times, the tension between these two landscapes left him feeling almost weightless, as if he belonged fully to neither. There were nights when he returned to his small room with the hum of voices still clinging to him. The voices of patience, the voices of books, the new voice of Freud, now echoing in his thoughts. He would sit in dim light, hands resting idle, staring at the quiet wall as if it might open into meaning. In these moments, the child who once built secret towers felt very near again. He began to notice something else too. As his understanding of the mind deepened, his own dreams intensified. Symbols grew bolder. Figures walked through his inner world with names he did not yet know. He dreamed of ancient quests, of winding staircases descending into hidden chambers, of voices calling from beneath water. These dreams did not frighten him. They drew him closer. Still, doubt moved beside him like a quiet companion. There were evenings when he wondered if he was following truth or simply the echo of his own imagination. Was this path leading him toward deeper understanding, or toward the very madness he studied in others? The question did not scream. It hovered gently, persistent as mist. In moments of fatigue, he thought of his father's quiet struggle with faith, the way certainty could crack under its own weight. He wondered whether every human construction, even the sciences of the mind, stood on foundations partly made of shadow. And if so, perhaps the shadow was not an enemy. Perhaps it was simply another face of light. His work at the hospital continued to deepen. One patient spoke of a great flood that had come in dreams, washing away a ruined world. Another spoke of a shining child who appeared in darkness as a guide. Jung felt a strange familiarity stir at such images. He had read them before in ancient texts and forgotten myths. Yet here they were, rising naturally from the minds of ordinary people who had never studied such stories. The question grew quieter but heavier. How could the same symbols appear again and again across different lives, different lands, different times? The idea did not yet have a name, but it began to breathe softly at the edges of his thoughts. Amid the slow rising current, his relationship with Freud continued to warm. They spoke openly now, debating with passion and trust. For Jung, it felt like standing before a great fire. Freud's brilliance warmed him, sharpened him, challenged him. Yet fire always carries its own danger. Jung sensed it dimly, like heat on the skin that warns even before it burns. There were moments when Freud spoke with unwavering certainty, when he tied all mysteries neatly back to a single source, a single logic. Jung admired the elegance of this simplicity, but deep down, he felt a tightening, as if something within him quietly resisted being confined to one explanation. He did not yet pull away. He leaned in. He studied. He waited for the right moment to listen to his own doubt. Life, outwardly, appeared steady. His reputation grew. His work gained notice. Conversation followed him into rooms now. Yet inwardly, he was as unsettled as ever, standing at the threshold of something vast and unnamed. The voices within his patients were growing louder in his understanding. The voices within himself were growing bolder too. Sometimes, late at night, when the world outside lay still and the hospital slept under starlight, Jung would return in memory to his childhood forests, to the lake's unmoving surface, to the feeling of being both small and infinite at once. He sensed even then that everything unfolding now had begun there. The dreams, the questions, the longing to touch what lay beneath appearances. He did not know that the path ahead would soon crack beneath his feet, that the warmth of friendship would one day cool into distance, that certainty would dissolve into visions so intense they would shake the borders of his sanity. All he knew, in these early years of rising connection and quiet confidence, was that he was walking deeper than ever before into the unseen. And so, as the night sealed itself gently around his quiet room and dreams began once again to stir behind his closed eyes, Carl Jung moved one step closer to the turning point that would soon change the direction of his soul. The invitation arrived not as a command, but as a quiet turning of the tide. A journey to Vienna, a deeper crossing into Freud's world. Jung felt the weight of it long before he packed his bags. There was excitement in his chest, yes, but also a soft, uneasy pressure, like the air before a summer storm. He told himself that this was growth, that this was what every searching mind must do. Step closer to another fire and feel its heat directly. When he arrived, Vienna felt alive in a way that unnerved him. Its streets breathed conversation and ambition. Its rooms were thick with ideas, smoke, and the quiet competition of sharp minds. And at the center of it all stood Freud, welcoming Jung with warmth that felt almost paternal. For hours they spoke again, just as before, words flowing without friction, minds leaning toward one another with the ease of long recognition. Yet this time something was different. Jung listened with the same care as always, but now he heard more than brilliance. He heard certainty, not the calm certainty of quiet knowing, but the rigid certainty that resists bending. Freud spoke of the mind as if its deepest mysteries had already been named and circled in ink. Desire, repression, conflict. The language was precise, strong, claiming ground with confidence. Jung nodded. He questioned gently. He offered examples from his own work. Dreams that did not bend neatly into these shapes. Symbols that seemed untouched by personal memory. Images that felt older than childhood, older than family, older than any single life. Freud listened, but his listening had edges now. Where once there had been shared curiosity, there was now a subtle guarding of territory. The warmth remained, but beneath it, a quiet strain began to hum. In the evenings, alone again in borrowed rooms, Jung felt the tension settle into his body like an unfamiliar ache. He sat by windows that looked down onto the glowing veins of the city and wondered when exactly admiration becomes distance. When gratitude begins to carry the weight of expectation. He felt it now, that expectation, that he would follow a certain path, that he would speak a certain language, that he would become, in time, a reflection of the man who had first welcomed him. The thought did not fill him with rebellion. It filled him with sorrow. He returned to his dreams for refuge, as he always had. But now his dreams grew sharper, more insistent. One night he saw himself walking through a wide field beneath a sky heavy with unseen movement. Another night he dreamed of a towering figure whose face shifted between many faces, none of them fully clear. He woke with the feeling that something within him was preparing to speak more loudly than ever before. Back at the hospital, his patients seemed to mirror his own inner unease. Their stories grew darker, more symbolic. A woman spoke of descending endlessly through a spiral stair, frightened yet unable to stop. A man dreamed of killing a shadow that only grew larger with each blow. Jung listened with a heart strangely aching, as if these images were rising not only from them, but with them. He began to write privately again, not for journals, not for colleagues, but for himself alone. Pages filled with questions that dared not be spoken aloud. What if the mind was not only shaped by personal history, but by something ancient that lived beneath it all? What if each person was not only an individual, but a doorway through which humanity itself kept dreaming. These were dangerous thoughts in a world hungry for clean definitions. Letters between Jung and Freud continued, still respectful, still careful. But the tone had shifted just slightly. Where once there had been shared exploration, now there was gentle persuasion from one side and quiet resistance from the other. Jung felt it in the way his words were received. He was no longer simply a fellow seeker. He was becoming a question mark. There were nights when he lay awake staring into darkness, feeling the slow pull of two opposing currents. On one side, loyalty, gratitude, intellectual family. On the other, the deep, wordless urging of his own inner truth. He did not want to choose. He wanted to believe that all paths could converge into one wider understanding. Yet something within him already knew that convergence would not come without fracture. He thought often of his father during this time, of the way faith and doubt had stood quietly beside one another in that small Swiss home. He saw now that every belief carries the seed of its own undoing, not as destruction but as transformation. Still, understanding this did not ease the ache of standing at the edge of change. Externally, his life continued to rise. His work gained respect. His name circulated with growing familiarity. Young students listened closely when he spoke. He seemed, to the world, a man stepping into his power. But inside, he felt like a traveler walking along a narrowing ridge with shadows dropping away on both sides. And then, one evening, exhaustion finally loosened his carefully held balance. A vision came to him not in sleep, but in waking stillness. He saw Europe drowned beneath a vast flood of blood, the waters rushing endlessly, carrying bodies and ruin across the land. He jolted upright, breath shallow, heart strangely calm and afraid at the same time. The image did not fade quickly. It lingered with a terrible clarity. He told himself it was only imagination, only stress, only the residue of long hours spent listening to human suffering. Yet the feeling that followed was too deep to dismiss. It was not the fear of personal madness. It was the fear of standing at the edge of something collective, something much larger than one mind. From that night on, the boundary between his inner world and the outer world grew thinner. His dreams pressed harder against waking life. His waking thoughts grew heavier with dreamlike weight. He felt as though a door long closed within him had creaked open, and the air pouring through it was both cold and luminous. He did not yet know that this was the beginning of his long descent, that the coming years would test the strength of his mind, his friendships, and his very sense of self. For now, he only felt the quiet trembling of a foundation beginning to shift. And so, as the world around him continued its steady rhythm, and the city lights flickered softly into the night, Carl Jung stood unknowingly at the threshold of the deepest journey he would ever take. The descent into his own shadow was drawing near, slow and irreversible. The first cracks appeared not with noise, but with silence. Jung began to feel the strain in pauses between conversations, in the way letters grew shorter, in the spaces where shared certainty once lived. With Freud, the distance was no longer hidden beneath warmth. It moved openly now, quiet but undeniable. Their ideas were no longer walking the same road, and both men could feel the road narrowing. Jung did not leave at once. He lingered. He questioned himself more harshly than anyone else ever could. Was he betraying a mentor, a friend, a path that had given him legitimacy in the world? Or was he, at last, stepping into the truth that had followed him since childhood? Loyalty and identity tightened around his chest like twin hands pulling in opposite directions. Some nights he longed for the comfort of clarity. Other nights he longed only for honesty, however dangerous it might be. When the break finally came, it was not a sudden storm. It was more like winter arriving a degree at a time, until warmth was simply gone. The letters stopped carrying wonder. Conversations grew careful, armored. And then, eventually, they stopped altogether. Jung felt the loss not like anger, but like grief. A quiet, sinking grief for what had been and would never return. Without Freud's guiding structure, the ground beneath him fell open. At first, the freedom felt light, exhilarating even, He was finally able to follow his own questions fully, without trimming their edges to fit another system. But freedom, when it arrives without shelter, can feel like being exposed to a vast, cold sky. And soon, that cold began to press in. His visions intensified. It was no longer just dreams at night. Images came during the day. Symbols rose uninvited while he sat at his desk or walked along quiet paths. He saw rivers of blood again, ancient figures with indistinct faces, cities crumbling beneath unseen forces. It felt as if the hidden world he had studied for years had decided to speak directly, without permission. At times, fear brushed his thoughts. The quiet, honest fear that he might be crossing the same border as his patients. That he, too, might be losing his footing in the shared world of clocks and streets and polite conversation. Yet even in fear, another feeling remained stronger. Curiosity. So he did something few would dare. He stopped running. Instead of turning away from the visions, he turned toward them. Each night, he sat alone and let his imagination descend freely. He recorded everything. The images, the voices, the shifting landscapes of his inner world. He did not analyze them at first. He simply witnessed them, as one might watch the tide move across a dark shore. In this practice, which he later called his descent into the unconscious, he became both traveler and mapmaker. At times, the journey terrified him. He encountered figures that seemed to carry ancient hostility, shadows that spoke in riddles, presences that felt older than his own life. Yet he did not look away. Somewhere beneath the fear lived a deep, unshakable trust that this darkness held meaning. Days blurred softly into nights. His outer life slowed. He reduced his public work. He spoke less in rooms where conversation once found him easily. Friends worried in whispered tones. Colleagues watched with measured distance. Jung did not explain himself. He could not. The language required for what he was living did not yet exist. In his inner wandering, he began to meet recurring figures. A wise old man, a fierce and silent shadow, a woman who seemed to carry intuition like a flame. These presences did not fade like ordinary dreams. They returned. They evolved. They taught. Jung felt, with quiet awe, that he was not inventing them. He was encountering them. And so, slowly, painfully, and with great care, he began to understand something radical. These figures were not only personal. They were universal. The same shapes that lived in ancient myths. The same roles that appeared in stories told around firelight thousands of years ago. The same faces that still peer out at us from books and screens and the quiet theaters of our own minds. This realization was not a sudden revelation. It unfolded like dawn does, gentle and persistent. With each return of these inner characters, Jung felt the weight of human history settling softly into the present moment. He was touching something shared, something vast. And in doing so, he was being reshaped. Yet transformation is never gentle alone. It is also lonely. There were weeks when Jung felt suspended between two lives, too strange for ordinary society, yet not entirely lost to it. He walked past acquaintances who sensed something had shifted but did not know how to name it. He answered questions with quiet smiles that revealed nothing. Behind those smiles lived storms and stars no one else could see. At times, exhaustion folded around him like a heavy cloak. The effort of carrying both the inner and outer worlds wore him thin. There were moments when he wondered if he would ever return completely, if this descent had an end or only infinite depth. But even in weariness, something within him remained steady, a soft center that had been present since childhood. The part of him that once stacked stones in silence, not knowing why, only knowing that the act itself mattered. That same impulse guided him now, to place meaning layer by layer inside the chaos. From this long inward winter, the earliest outlines of his greatest ideas began to form, not as theories yet, only as feelings, hints, gentle truths that had not yet found their voice. The sense that humanity shared more than language and blood. The sense that our dreams belonged not only to us as individuals, but to a deeper river flowing through all generations. He was standing now at the threshold of that realization. And so, as the outer world moved on unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding within one solitary man. Jung continued his descent with cautious devotion. Each step inward carried him further from certainty, yet closer to something that felt, paradoxically, like home. And somewhere in the unseen distance, his ideas were beginning to gather their shape. The winter of his inner world stretched long and deep, yet it did not remain empty. Out of the silence, patterns began to emerge, slow as stars through fog. Jung noticed that the figures he met within did not behave like random fragments of imagination. They carried intention. They spoke with a gravity that felt earned, ancient. The wise old man did not flatter him. The shadow did not merely frighten him. Each presence felt like a living fragment of something far larger than one private mind. He began to sense that the psyche was not a house of isolated rooms, but a vast landscape shared through time. In the quiet ritual of his nightly descents, he listened more than he questioned. He allowed the images to rise and fall on their own terms. There were nights when tears came without clear cause. Nights when wonder softened him into stillness. Nights when fear pressed so close it tightened his breath. Yet through it all he remained, sitting, writing, witnessing. The outside world felt increasingly distant, as if it were happening behind thick glass. Conversations sounded faint. Social gestures felt borrowed. He moved through the day with polite care, but his attention was always tilted inward, listening for the echo of the night. Some would later call this dangerous. Others would later call it madness that healed itself. Jung called it necessary, and slowly, softly, understanding began to crystallize. He saw that each of those inner figures reflected something human, something shared. The wise figure mirrored our longing for guidance. The shadow carried everything we bury in shame and fear. The feminine presence held intuition, feeling, connection. These were not inventions. They were inheritances, quiet companions that humanity had carried since its beginnings, disguised in different stories, wearing different names. This realization did not arrive with thunder. It arrived the way morning does, with a subtle light that you only notice once the room is already glowing. He began to write again, not as a patient in his own descent, but as a translator of what he was learning. The words came carefully at first, still uncertain of their own courage. He spoke of shared symbols, of dream images that crossed cultures without permission, of inner structures that existed long before any single life began. Each sentence felt like placing a fragile bridge over vast, unmapped space. Yet even as meaning came into view, peace did not follow immediately. The deeper he traveled inward, the more he felt the weight of what he was bringing back. To say that the human mind was shaped not only by personal memory, but by something ancient beneath it all was to stand against the foundations of his field. It meant stepping away not only from Freud, but from the safety of the accepted shore. And Jung felt that loneliness once more, the old childhood loneliness he had thought he had outgrown. There were evenings when he stood near the lake of his youth again, watching light dissolve into water, feeling the familiar ache of standing between worlds. The surface reflected the sky with effortless grace, while beneath it moved unseen currents with their own secret force. He felt that same division within himself, the visible and the hidden, the spoken and the unspeakable. At times, doubt returned with quiet persistence. What if these ideas were illusions shaped by isolation? What if he had simply fallen in love with his own inner theater? The question lingered, soft but sharp. Yet each time it surfaced, life itself seemed to answer. Patients would speak dreams that mirrored images from distant myth. Children would draw symbols they had never been shown. Films, stories, and ancient texts would converge on the same shapes again and again. The patterns were too consistent to ignore. He returned to his work with patience, not as a man searching for validation, but as a man listening for echoes. And the echoes answered, over and over, in the same symbols, the same inner dramas, the same quiet struggles dressed in different personal histories. Jung did not impose meaning. He waited for it to reveal itself, and it did. What began to take shape now was the idea that would one day be named the collective unconscious. He did not coin the words yet. At first, it lived only as a feeling, a deep, steady knowing that beneath our individual lives flows a shared psychic river, that our fears are not only personal, that our longings are not born from us alone, that every human walks with invisible ancestors whispering within their dreams. This thought did not comfort him fully. It humbled him. It meant that no one stands alone, and no one is fully separate, that our private battles are also ancient ones, that each person carries a quiet responsibility not only to themselves, but to the long, invisible lineage of the human soul. As this understanding settled deeper into him, Jung felt his fear slowly transform, not vanish, but reshape itself into reverence. He no longer felt that he was losing his mind. He felt that he was meeting it fully for the first time. Still, the cost remained heavy. Public life crept back toward him, cautious and curious. Invitations returned. Questions followed. Some listened with genuine wonder, others with thinly veiled skepticism. Jung did not argue loudly. He did not defend himself with sharp edges. He spoke as one who had been changed by something that did not need to force belief. His words were firm, but his tone remained gentle. Yet when he stood alone again, the weight of what he carried pressed into his body. There were nights when fatigue wrapped around him like storm clouds, nights when the inner images returned with overwhelming intensity, as if testing whether he could still hold their fire without burning. He would sit in the half-light, breathing slowly, reminding himself that even fire can be a teacher when approached with care. And through it all, something steady kept forming beneath the turbulence. A quiet confidence not rooted in approval, but in alignment. The sense that for the first time in his life, he was no longer drifting between worlds, but learning to walk with both. The boy who once felt split in two was slowly becoming whole. Yet the world beyond his study was changing too. History itself was drawing a dark breath. The shadows he had seen in vision were beginning, subtly, to take shape in the outer world. And Jung, who had walked so long beneath the surface of the human spirit, would soon be forced to witness what happens when the shadows of millions rise together. For now, he continued his work in the quiet rhythm of days and nights, writing, listening, dreaming, bridging worlds one careful sentence at a time. His ideas were no longer only his. They were beginning to ripple outward, touching minds he would never meet. And so, as the unseen river of the collective soul whispered through him with growing clarity, Carl Jung stood at the edge of a new era in his life. The descent had given him vision. The ascent would demand courage. And the shadow of the world was moving closer. The world outside his window no longer felt distant, felt restless. Newspapers whispered of unrest moving through cities and nations like a low, spreading fever. Old structures trembled. New angers gathered their breath. Jung read these signs with a quiet unease, not as a politician, not as a prophet, but as a man who had seen the same movements before in the theater of the inner world. What rises unseen within one soul, he had learned, can one day rise within many. His visions returned with a calmer intensity now, no longer wild storms, but deep currents. Where once there had been terror, now there was recognition. The rivers of blood he had seen were no longer only personal nightmares. They felt like warnings written in symbols older than language. He did not speak of them publicly. Some truths are too heavy to carry in crowded rooms. Instead, he focused on the work that could be done quietly. One life at a time. One dream at a time. One shadow at a time. In his consulting room, the air carried a different weight than it once had. Jung no longer listened only for personal history. He listened for the voice beneath it. When a man spoke of rage that frightened him, Jung heard the ancient warriors stirring in the dark. When a woman spoke of suffocating sorrow, Jung heard the universal grief of loss echoing through generations. These were not theories to him. They were living presences, passing gently through human form. His patients often left not with solved problems, but with a strange sense of being seen more deeply than they had ever known. Some felt unsettled. Others felt lighter. A few felt both at once. Jung accepted all of it. Transformation, he now understood, rarely arrives as comfort alone. At times, he wondered if he was asking too much of the human heart, to meet its shadow honestly, to stand before its hidden inheritance, to take responsibility not only for conscious choices, but for unconscious tides. Yet each time that doubt returned, he remembered his own descent. He remembered what it felt like to be lost in images with no map. And he also remembered the quiet clarity that came only after he stopped running. He did not wish that terror on anyone, but he could not deny the truth he had found within it. There were evenings when fatigue pressed against his bones, and he allowed himself to rest without analysis. On such nights, he returned to simple things: the way lamplight softened the edges of a room, the slow comfort of tea warming his hands, the sound of wind moving gently through trees outside his home. These moments did not carry symbols. They carried presence. And presence, he had learned, is a medicine of its own. Yet even in rest, his mind continued its quiet weaving. He began to see that his life had never truly been about conflict with Freud or rebellion against schools of thought. Those were only surface waves. Beneath them flowed a deeper movement, a lifelong conversation between the visible world and the invisible one, a bridge he had been building since he was a child without knowing its name. The lonely boy, the careful student, the eager collaborator, the solitary explorer of inner worlds, all of them lived within him still, not as contradictions, but as chapters of a single unfolding story. And slowly, with patience shaped by suffering and wonder in equal measure, Jung began to step fully back into the outer world, not as he had been before, seeking approval or structure, but as a man carrying his own compass. He lectured, he wrote, he spoke cautiously, not to convince, but to invite. His ideas spread not with thunder, but with the steady persistence of roots beneath stone. Still, he sensed that his personal transformation was only a beginning, that the storms gathering in the world would soon test the human soul in ways deeper than any single theory could hold. He felt the shadow of that future not as fear alone, but as responsibility. If humanity was to face its darkness, it would need language for what it was seeing. It would need mirrors. It would need guides who had walked those inner paths and returned with their minds intact. Some nights, before sleep closed around him, he would pause in the doorway between waking and dream and feel that old familiar tension settle softly in his chest. The tension of standing at the meeting place of worlds. Then he would breathe slowly and allow himself to drift. For he now knew something that had once terrified him, that the darkness within is not only a threat, it is also a teacher. And so, as his first great descent reached its quiet end and the contours of his life's work began to glow more clearly in the half-light, Carl Jung stood ready for the next movement of his story. The world would soon ask humanity to look into its shadow on a scale never known before. And Jung, who had listened to the dark since childhood, would find his voice needed more than ever. And as the night deepened outside his window and the unseen river continued its endless flow, the man who once feared madness now stood prepared to help others glimpse meaning within it. And somewhere in that darkening future, the shared dreams of humanity were already gathering their breath. The world did not change all at once. It shifted the way pressure shifts beneath the surface of the sea, invisible at first, yet gathering its quiet force. Jung felt this movement before most could name it, in the subtle hardening of voices in public rooms, in the way fear began to hide beneath pride, in the way old wounds of nations started to ache again after long sleep. He listened to these outer changes the same way he listened to dreams, not as noise, but as symbols rising from a deeper layer of life. His ideas, once fragile and private as candlelight, now began to take clearer form in the world. Words followed him more faithfully than they once had. Students leaned closer. Readers lingered longer over his pages. The shared river he had sensed in silence was now being felt by others, even if they did not yet know its name. Jung did not rush this unveiling. He let meaning arrive at its own pace, the way dawn enters a dark room without announcement. Yet even as his work grew outward, his relationship with the shadow remained intimate and personal. He knew now that no one ever finishes meeting their darkness. One only learns to walk beside it with steadier breath. Some evenings, when the weight of the world pressed too close, he returned to the lake again, watching how the surface accepted light and shadow without resistance. He learned from the water that contradiction can be held without fracture. The sense of responsibility that lived in him no longer felt heavy in the same way. Felt shaped, given purpose. He was not meant to save the world. He was meant to help it see itself more clearly. And that, he knew, was often the harder task. In quiet rooms, far from the restless streets, he continued to listen to those who came to him wounded and searching. He watched ordinary people courageously approach their own hidden depths, trembling yet willing. In their eyes, he often saw the reflection of his own long descent. And in each small moment of understanding, he saw proof that the darkness does not only destroy, it reveals. Outside, history continued to gather its breath. The tremors he had once seen in vision now moved along borders and through crowds. Flags were lifted, voices sharpened, anger found uniform and rhythm. Jung felt the electric stirring of a collective force rising from the same place his symbols had come from. The same source that births heroes and healers can also give shape to destroyers. He knew this with an ache that never fully left his chest. Some nights, as sleep approached, he felt again that old childhood sensation of being small beneath something immeasurably vast. But now the vastness no longer felt empty. It felt alive with human longing, human fear, human hope searching blindly for form. The collective soul of humanity, still dreaming, still struggling to wake. He wondered quietly how many would recognize the shadows when they arrived wearing familiar faces. How many would mistake ancient forces for modern certainty? How many would look outward for enemies instead of inward for understanding? These questions did not make him bitter. They made him tender, for he knew now, more surely than ever, that every storm begins first as a whisper in the unconscious. As the nights deepened and the world leaned unknowingly toward its coming trials, Jung stood at a strange, still point in his life. The long descent that had once threatened to unmake him had instead reshaped him. He had walked through fear without surrendering to it. He had listened to madness without becoming lost inside it. And in doing so, he had found a language the world would soon need more than it yet realized. The boy who once wandered alone through forests, feeling the world watch him silently, was now a man standing quietly at the edge of history. He did not seek to be a prophet. He only sought to remain honest with what he had seen. And as the unseen currents of humanity gathered into visible motion beyond his windows, Carl Jung closed one chapter of his life with a steady, inward breath. The work of the inner world had given him eyes. The work of the outer world was about to test what he truly saw. The night outside was calm, but in the deep places of the human soul, something vast was beginning to stir. The dawn arrived quietly, a pale wash over Vienna's rooftops, yet within Jung it felt like a pulse. The air carried no announcement, no herald, only a soft insistence, a gentle tremor beneath the surface of daily life. He rose, aware that the world outside moved with its usual rhythms, but sensed that something subtle and immense had begun to gather. The collective currents he had long glimpsed in dreams were now brushing against waking consciousness, brushing lightly, teasing recognition. In his study, the desk still bore traces of the night's vigil. Open notebooks, ink-stained hands, the faint curl of candle wax hardened in small rivulets. He approached them carefully, as one might approach fragile glass, knowing that within these pages lay patterns of a vast human psyche, delicate yet insistent. Each line, each sketch of a symbol, carried more than personal meaning. It hummed with a resonance that transcended time, as if reaching across centuries to touch a hidden chord in every mind that would encounter it. Outside, the city stirred. Voices rose, flags caught wind in streets that carried both hope and tension. Jung noticed, without fear, the patterns of human behavior, the subtle tremors of ambition, pride, and quiet despair, moving like undercurrents beneath the visible surface. He felt their echoes in his own chest, not as a burden, but as a reminder that the inner work of understanding could not remain private. Symbols, dreams, and shadows had become a language for the world itself, and he had only begun to translate. Later, he walked to the lake of his youth, where water lay flat and reflective, capturing the sky's pale blues and muted golds in perfect stillness. Here, he remembered the boy who had once felt both infinitesimal and infinite at once, and he understood that this duality had never left him. The lake taught him that light and shadow could coexist without conflict, that contradictions could be held without fracture, that the unseen depths could reveal as much as they concealed. He breathed deeply, letting the calm mirror the inner stillness he had cultivated through years of descent. Evenings returned to their ritual. Jung received those who sought understanding, those whose souls carried burdens too heavy for daylight alone. Each visitor reflected fragments of the collective currents he had long studied, glimpses of the archetypes he had met in the inner world made flesh in human form. Some trembled, others shone with a quiet resolve, and in every encounter, he realized anew that the shadows of the human heart did not destroy, they illuminated. The world beyond his windows continued its slow, gathering shift. Cities murmured with unrest, nations breathed in unsteady rhythms, and the whispers of history rose beneath the surface, almost imperceptible yet undeniable to those attuned. Jung stood, ever the observer, feeling the weight of this unfolding, but also its possibility. The quiet storm within him had matured into a calm vigilance. He understood now that to witness the darkness, to translate it, to hold it without fear, was the first step in preparing others to meet their own inner landscapes. At night, alone in the half-light of his study, Jung would pause at the edge of understanding, aware that the unseen river of the collective soul flowed through all things. It carried both terror and hope, shadow and illumination, and as he let the quiet awareness settle over him, he felt a rare steadiness. The descent had not unmade him, it had reshaped him, and as the world leaned unknowingly into trials yet to come, Carl Jung, who had once wandered lost through forests and dreams, now stood ready to help others navigate the vast, stirring depths of their own inner worlds. The night deepened. Stars, distant and indifferent, watched silently, and somewhere, beneath the conscious surface of humanity, something immense began to stir. Morning light spilled into the lecture hall, pale and tentative, brushing the worn wood of benches and the spines of waiting notebooks. Jung entered quietly, his presence unassuming, yet charged with a new kind of awareness. The eyes that met his were curious, respectful, but also guarded, for the world of ideas could be a treacherous space. He did not rush. He did not demand understanding. He merely began to speak, his voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of one who had listened far more than he had spoken. At first, his students heard only fragments, theories couched in cautious language. Dreams, symbols, myths, the patterns of human imagination. They seemed ethereal, almost ungraspable. And yet, as Jung spoke, a subtle recognition passed among them. He sensed it in the tilt of heads, the small, almost imperceptible nods. Something he had long observed in solitude, the shared currents beneath all minds, was now beginning to ripple outward. The collective unconscious, though unnamed, was quietly asserting its presence. Outside the lecture hall, the city moved with its habitual rhythms, yet subtle shifts were underway. Conversations hummed with unrest, ambition, and fear. The world itself seemed to echo the archetypes Jung had traced within his inner journeys. Warriors of conflict, wise figures of guidance, shadowed presences lurking in the hidden recesses of human ambition. He had long known that the inner and outer worlds mirrored one another, and now, teaching, he felt the reflection take shape in the attentive minds before him. In private consultations, the phenomenon grew more tangible. Patients returned with stories that mirrored each other, though they had never met. Dreams crossed boundaries of culture and geography, ancient motifs appearing unbidden in modern lives. Symbols that had once seemed private and enigmatic now revealed a strange universality. Jung watched, listened, recorded, and began to articulate what he had sensed. Humanity shared a psychic river flowing beneath the surface, a current older than any single life, carrying memory, fear, desire, and hope alike. Evenings remained a sanctuary. Jung would return to the lake of his youth, where water reflected light and shadow without judgment, and he would consider the day's encounters. The ripples in the lake mirrored the ripples he saw in human consciousness. Here he understood more clearly than ever. Knowledge alone did not suffice. Insight required courage, the courage to witness, to sit with the darkness, and to allow the unseen currents to speak. And as he walked along the water's edge, the weight of this responsibility settled upon him, tempered now by the steady pulse of understanding. The stirrings in society continued. Voices hardened in public rooms, flags lifted, and anger found rhythm. But Jung's attention remained focused on what he could touch, what he could guide. The collective unconscious was not a theoretical abstraction anymore. It was alive in each gesture, each word, each encounter, waiting for recognition. And he, who had once wandered lost within the shadows of his own mind, now had the privilege of being its early witness, translator, and guide. At night, alone in his study, he would light a candle, its glow warm against the shadows. He began writing essays, notes, letters, careful, deliberate, patient. The concepts he recorded were fragile, yet luminous. Words became bridges, connecting the interior landscapes he had mapped in solitude to the minds of others. The river he had felt in silence was beginning to flow into shared awareness, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unstoppable. And somewhere in the darkened streets beyond the study, the world leaned toward trials yet unseen. Jung felt it not as fear but as responsibility. The shadows of humanity would rise, as they always did, yet now they could be met with understanding, guidance, and insight. He had descended into the unconscious, and now he had returned, carrying a map, however tentative, for others who would one day follow. The candle flickered softly. The pages of his notes whispered of unseen currents. And the first currents of the collective unconscious, once private and intangible, were now emerging into the minds of those who could listen, learn, and bear witness. The city outside was alive with its usual cadence, yet for Jung, the familiar rhythms had begun to feel sharper, more scrutinizing. Lecture halls that once welcomed curiosity now carried whispers of doubt. The students' eager eyes sometimes flickered with hesitation, their admiration tempered by the invisible weight of convention. Even colleagues, those who had nodded politely at his words, now paused mid-conversation, questioning in silence, wary of the ideas he had begun to voice. Letters arrived, carefully composed, polite yet edged with unease. Questions, challenges, and subtle criticisms threaded through the ink. Your observations are interesting, but speculative. Where is the evidence? Are these not flights of imagination rather than science? Jung read each with steady patience. His inner world had prepared him for this, yet even he could not deny the ache of recognition, the same ache he had felt watching his own visions take shape in solitude, knowing the world might never see their truth. He began to notice how rigid the boundaries of accepted thought had grown. The corridors of academia were lined with certainty, walls built from decades of repetition, arguments neatly filed, and ideas rarely tested beyond their familiar forms. To challenge them was to risk isolation, to speak of a shared unconscious, of symbols that transcended culture and personal history, was to speak a language few yet understood. And still he did not retreat. In the evenings, Jung returned to his study, the candlelight flickering against the shadows. Here, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the scrutiny. Each word he had written, each lecture he had delivered, now stood vulnerable before unseen eyes. He reminded himself of the quiet, persistent currents he had witnessed in dreams and in patience, patterns too consistent to dismiss. He reminded himself that the inner truths he had seen were not his alone. They belonged to humanity, flowing beneath the surface, waiting to be recognized. Yet even as resistance pressed against him, moments of subtle triumph emerged. A student would linger after class, eyes alight with a question, a spark of curiosity that dared to reach beyond the safety of accepted norms. A patient would recount a dream, and Jung would see patterns that confirmed, gently, that his observations were more than conjecture. These small confirmations became anchor points, reminders that the work of the unconscious could not be fully contained, could not be silenced by skepticism alone. Outside, the world shifted imperceptibly. Public voices hardened, newspapers carried sharper tones, and streets thrummed with unease. Jung watched with a quiet, detached attention. The tremors he had glimpsed in vision were surfacing in reality. The collective fears and longings, the shadows of nations beginning to rise. His own inner descent had prepared him to recognize the warning signs. What emerged within the human psyche, unchecked, could manifest outside, shaping events and histories far larger than any individual mind. And yet, despite the pressure, he felt a new steadiness. Criticism no longer threatened his foundation. The doubts of others could be observed, measured, and placed alongside the evidence of lived experience, patient observation, and the unfolding patterns of the mind. He began to understand that true work, the work that would one day allow humanity to meet its own shadows, required patience, courage, and the willingness to walk alone at times, unbowed by disbelief. Night deepened. The lamp's flame flickered against the walls, casting elongated shadows. Jung sat, pen in hand, not defending, not persuading, but mapping, translating, witnessing. He had descended into darkness. He had emerged into scrutiny. And he had learned that the work of the inner world must endure the world's judgment before it could be shared, carefully, one mind at a time. And in that quiet determination, he recognized a truth deeper than fear or doubt. The shadow of the world would rise, and when it did, the language of the unconscious would be needed more than ever. The work of illumination, begun in solitude, was now tested at the threshold of reality.